Hi, welcome to Valley News Digest. I'm John Gregg, the news editor of the Valley News. We're the daily paper in West Lebanon covering the Upper Valley. We've been here since 1952, doing stories out of Windsor County, Orange County, Grafton County, and Sullivan County, and of course, statewide issues in both New Hampshire and Vermont. We're also on the web at vnews.com. We're joined today by our healthcare reporter, Nora Doyle-Burr, and a little bit later by one of our sports reporters, Tris Wykes, who covered a pretty thrilling season for Dartmouth football. But first, Nora, thank you for being here. Welcome. Welcome back. You've been on a couple of times. You recently wrote a pretty big story about efforts to address the housing crunch here in the Upper Valley. What's going on? What'd you find out?
Yeah, well, I guess to start with, we found that there's really not enough housing for people who are trying to live in the Upper Valley, especially here in the center of the Upper Valley, the Hartford-Lebanon area. And so everybody's thinking about it. It's also costing a lot of money for people to live. So people are struggling with the cost.
Yeah, I think you talked to one guy who lives in Wilder and had 3 different part-time jobs and was trying to find housing. Is there a sense of how many units or what sort of the problem is? Yeah,
well, so it's part of what people are talking about, but for a long time they've said we're short about 5,000. That's affordable units of housing. So, but I think at this stage, you know, what the planners are saying is that about between like 15 and 20,000 people are paying too much for housing. So that's like more than 30% of a household's income going towards housing costs.
Right. So when people are paying $1,000 a month for rent, if that's a pretty tough stretch on families making, you know, under $40,000, $50,000. It sounds like.
Yeah.
I gather, what are people doing about it? I gather some regional planning commissions, just alphabet soup sometimes with these groups, but they're undertaking a study, or what are they doing?
Yeah. So the 3 regional planning commissions, the one based in Lebanon and the other across the river in Woodstock, and another smaller one in Ascutney, they're looking into, you know, first how many units they need to update that 5,000 number. But then also what type of housing, you know, sort of, you know, apartments to, you know, what sizes, and then what price points, and in what communities, maybe. And then also really what the challenge has been in building new housing, because, you know, we've known for some time that we're short housing and that people are struggling to find places to live that they can afford, but we haven't built them at the rate that, you know, certainly employees and employers might like to see.
Yeah, so. And so this sounds like they're going to try and take a pretty comprehensive look. Two Rivers, Ottaquechee Regional Planning Commission in Woodstock, and Upper Valley, Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission in Lebanon, and the Southern Windsor County Regional Planning Commission down in Windsor. So that does cover a lot of ground. Also on the state level, I gather Republican governor in New Hampshire, Chris Sununu, came out with some sort of housing plan or had a task force. What's going on there?
Yeah, so he put together a task force with some policymakers and planners. And they came out with some proposals that, I guess it was late last month. So he'd like to see some beefed up training for planning, municipal zoning and planning board members. So everybody's on the same page when they're looking at projects. And then also some incentives and some fee transparency. And some timelines, so to make it more predictable, to try to reduce costs for developers as they're trying to put these projects together.
Right, because in other words, the argument from developers always has been is we don't make as much money developing affordable housing, so if the process gets streamlined, at least maybe it makes it easier for them to undertake that. Right? And in Vermont, there's talk, I think you talked to some legislators, there's talk of a possible $50 million housing bond?
Yeah. I guess it had been up for consideration last session, but didn't make it through, and that would be somewhat similar, I think, trying to incentivize development of new housing. And then also some of the money, I think, would go toward trying to make existing housing stock more efficient, and just more appropriate for sort of the lifestyles of people today.
Right. Certainly lots of old housing stock in these two states that it could be upgraded and made more energy efficient.
Yeah.
You've also encountered, and Tim Camarado, who covers Lebanon, have done some stories. Private employers also are starting to make plans. Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center and Dartmouth College. How come and where? What are they kind of looking at?
So I mean, they're looking at the Route 120 corridor in Lebanon, and they also sort of did an assessment of each of their needs individually, and so Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center here in Lebanon figured they need about 800 units just for their staff, and the college, Dartmouth College, figures they need about 500 for staff and graduate students. They're having trouble. So the college has pitched a plan to build, I think it's about 300 units on Mount Support Road, on college-owned land there. And the hospital is looking at a property sort of north of Centera near Jesse's restaurant. It's a little bit of a challenging lot, but they're looking at collaborating with the developer to build some housing there. It would put the employees near services and also near a shuttle line, so they could easily get to work.
Sure. I mean, the advanced transit brings people in from down from Bellows Falls to go work at Dartmouth Hitchcock and that sort of thing.
Yeah, they're trying to reduce cars on that road.
Yeah. And then you have also talked to Twin Pines, the housing trust that is deeply involved in some of these projects, especially in the core of the Upper Valley. They've added some units. What have they done recently, and what do they say is really needed in the Valley to sort of help develop more housing?
Yeah, so just in the past year, Twin Pines has opened new affordable, well, mixed income housing in both White River and West Lebanon. And I talked with Andrew Winter, the executive director there, and he was saying that one of the challenges is just finding land in the right location with access to things like water and sewer. And he'd really like to see some federal investment in municipal sewer.
Yeah, because when you're building a 60-unit building, a septic field can be a problem.
Right,
Better to have municipal sewer.
Yep, totally. But I mean, he was glad to have the interests both of the planning commissions and of the legislators and governor in the Twin States. He's glad people are thinking about housing.
Yeah, well, it's a bit of a building boom going on around the Upper Valley, and good to see some more affordable units coming online. Thank you, Nora, for being here. It's clearly an issue we're going to track and read more in the Valley News in the months to come on this. So thanks. And next we'll have Tris Wykes talking about Dartmouth football and quite a season that he watched and chronicled for the Valley News. Joining us now is Tris Wykes, who's been a sports writer at the Valley News for the past 10 years, grew up in Hanover, and covers Dartmouth football and Dartmouth College sports, and was at some pretty amazing games this fall with the football team. Tris, thanks. Welcome for being here. The team finished 9-1, and they did more than that. They wound up tied. Bring us up to speed. Tied for the Ivy League championship. Is that right?
Yeah, they tied for the Ivy League title with Yale, both with 6-1 records. It's Dartmouth's, by their accounting, 19th Ivy League title. Some of them shared, some of them not, which is the best record in the Ivy League since it was formed in 1956. And it was formed as a football conference to sort of get away from the big football movement that was taking over at the time. The Ivy League schools used to be in the part of the national picture and decided they would take a step back. So, yeah, 19 titles is impressive. Their last one was in 2015. And, yeah, it halfway through the season, it looked like they might cruise to an undefeated season and an easy crown, and it turned out not being that way.
Yeah, but it couldn't have happened except a pretty miraculous play against Harvard on November 2nd down in Cambridge, and you were there. Tell us about that.
Right. The setting, first of all, was amazing. That stadium is the oldest college football stadium still in use. It was built in 1903. It looks like it was built in 1903. It's been kept, in pretty good shape.
Looks like a Roman Colosseum.
Yeah, it's a miniature Roman Colosseum, and so that's kind of surreal and cool. And then they got a crowd, which for these days is pretty good, of about 22,000. And the Dartmouth fans were they bust in, and other kids drove down. So there was a young field of the crowd to go along with the usual alumni. And they were just into the game. I mean, they shouted and screamed, and it even though the score was very low, it was 6-3 for almost the entire game, it really had the feel of this matters and people are fired up about it. It was really a neat scene. So with that as the backdrop, Dartmouth had a fumble and an interception late in the game in the last 4 or 5 minutes, and a decent chunk of those fired up people started to head for the exits, including some who had fairly strong ties to Dartmouth in the administration or former athletes, et cetera, et cetera. So Dartmouth gets the ball back on its own 6-yard line.
With less than 2 minutes.
Less than a minute.
Wow.
59 seconds, I believe, was the actual time. And they have 2 timeouts. And they've only scored 3 points all day. But Harvard plays the traditional and much lamented prevent defense, where they put all their defenders far back, and Dartmouth picks their way down the field with short passes. They get to the 43-yard line with 6 seconds left. And they call a play that's supposed to go right, and the quarterback is going to throw up the classic Hail Mary pass into the end zone. He goes right, and there are 3 Harvard defenders waiting for him. Luckily, 2 of them run into each other as he slips between them. And this kid, Derek Kyler, who was the quarterback, was a very good athlete back in his hometown in Illinois in many sports. And he wasn't super highly recruited, but he's the kind of guy that is good at any sort of thing you do. So he's able to scramble and weave his way out to the other side of the field, and just like in the backyard, throws this ball up off his back foot. And it goes up, and it seems to take about 4 or 5 minutes to come down. And the play before, I'd been on the 30 or 40-yard line, and I was standing next to Dartmouth's video person, and I said, I'll go down and capture the miraculous finish. And he said, ha ha, and slapped me on the shoulder, and he stayed right where he was. And so I walked down to the goal line, and I could see all these different players converging, through the viewfinder of the camera, looking up. And I just tried to pull back a wide shot, and I just laid on the trigger for about 10 or 12 shots, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. In this case, it worked, and you were able to sort of see the progression of exactly how the ball bounced around amongst people before landing in Masaki Ertz's arms for a 9-6 victory.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty amazing. You've got one photo with the ball up in the air, and it's probably 5 players looking at it, and then the next with it barely in the receiver's arms.
No timeouts left. 6 seconds to go, fourth quarter. 3 wideouts to the right. Kyler takes the snap. He's quickly got to throw it. Rolling to his right. He's got to get rid of it, and he's going to keep it going. Now he's going to throw it deep, and he heaves it down the field. Jump ball, deflected. Caught! Caught! Touchdown! Touchdown! Touchdown, Dartmouth! Touchdown! Unbelievable! Unbelievable! I don't believe it! Dartmouth wins it on a Hail Mary! Unbelievable! Unreal! The miracle in Cambridge!
Probably one of the greatest plays ever for Dartmouth, don't you think?
Yeah, they've been playing. This is their 138th season, so I'm sure we are critically overlooking an amazing play from 1926 or something that we don't know about or don't remember. But you have to think, with everything we just described, perhaps the greatest ending or most dramatic and exciting ending in Dartmouth college football history.
Sure. So after that highlight, they went on. They had another big victory over Princeton, who is a real powerhouse in the Ivy League with football, right? How'd they do that? And then they lost sort of briefly, and then they lost to Cornell, which wasn't supposed to be a good team, right? What happened those two games?
Well, right after the emotional skyrocket of Harvard, they then had to go to Yankee Stadium. They'd agreed to trade one of their home games to play at Yankee Stadium against Princeton. Princeton was celebrating that week the 100th anniversary? No, the 150th anniversary of the very first college football game, at least what's recognized as it, against Rutgers. Now, in the smart working world, Rutgers would have said, hey, we'd like to be in on this action, but Rutgers' athletic department is in chaos, to put it mildly. They couldn't do it. Princeton floated the idea to Dartmouth. Dartmouth said, yeah, we'll give up one of our home games if we can play at Yankee Stadium. They drew more than 20,000 fans there. It was a mob scene around the bars. You know, both schools have a lot of alumni in the finance district, et cetera. Dartmouth won that game, and so that was 2 weeks in a row that they had to, for different reasons, sort of reach an emotional peak. They come back home. They've gotten through what they had to think was the tough part of their schedule. And here comes Cornell, which is second to last in the league, has lost 10 consecutive times to Dartmouth. Not an imposing opponent. And I think Dartmouth just scrambled a little bit. They didn't have a lot of energy. Cornell knew they could make their season if they beat Dartmouth. And Dartmouth was just a little bit off. They were never able to make a big play or a series of big plays, I guess, that led to victory. And as it got closer and closer to the end, you could just feel the expectations of momentum go over on a teeter-totter. And I think, Dartmouth was deeply unhappy, but I think for them, the Ivy League championship has always been the goal in their mind. Not many people start a season and figure you're never going to lose the whole season. And this team had overachieved a little bit, so I don't think it was a crushing blow. But it's certainly, it's no fun. Everybody does a double take when they look at the score the next morning.
Sure. But they recovered. And incidentally, to our viewers, if you heard a strange noise about a minute ago, we're here in the CATV studios in downtown White River, and that was a train going by. It's great to hear those. So November 23rd, last game of the season, down in Providence, right? And they hung on to beat Brown, right? Narrowly, right?
They rallied to beat Brown. They were down 10-0. They were down, I think, 22-3 at one point. And it just, you knew that Dartmouth was the much more talented team, the deeper team, the more veteran team. Brown's last team in the league, they had just the week before, snapped a 20-game losing streak in the league play. They were playing, I think, 3 freshmen on the defensive backfield. They had freshmen in a couple other places. They just didn't match up with Dartmouth physically or athletically, but they played very cohesively, and they're under a first-year coach who's doing a great job down there, James Perry. Perry's nephew, E.J. Perry, transferred to Brown from Boston College before the start of the season. And again, you're facing a team that can make its season if they beat you. Dartmouth needed to win to at least clinch a share of the Ivy League title. If various other things had played out, they could have won the title by itself. They could have been left on the outside with 8-2. They came back, and the very last play of the game, while not nearly as exciting, I guess, as tension-filled as the Harvard one, Brown threw a pass with about 1:20 left that it looked like the receiver had it, then he got hit, and the ball popped up, and Isaiah Swan, who is a cornerback from Arizona, who is Dartmouth's career interceptions leader with 17, that was his 17th and final interception of his career, and it couldn't have come at a better time because it would have been so crushing for Dartmouth and its fans to start 8-0, lose its last 2 games to the 2 lowliest teams, and then perhaps not get a share of the Ivy League title. So Dartmouth ended up, they thought after they'd won that they were going to win the title outright because Harvard was seemingly regularly handling Yale. Harvard gave up 2 touchdowns in the last 90 seconds, including losing an onside kick, and so it ended up being Yale and Dartmouth sharing the title, which perhaps in the way it ended was fitting for a season that's gone up and down and sideways at times.
Sure. And the victory over Brown was by less than a touchdown, obviously. They
28-23.
Right. So that if that had been a catch in the end zone, that would have been bad news for the Big Green. What's the season say about Coach Buddy Stevens?
I think it says that, and this goes back a ways, you know, his team, his program was winless in 2008, 0-10. He had come back in 2005 after a previous stint in the late 80s and early 90s. He took the job, I think, he had told people we need a lot of things to improve here if we're going to have even a chance. We need better facilities. We need more money for recruiting. We need academic support people. We need all sorts of things. And I think Dartmouth sort of said yes, yes, yes. And then the recession came along, and that made it harder on all fronts monetarily. So it took longer than it probably should have. By 2008, they were winless. And Dartmouth was, there was a year where they had an interim athletic director, and then they hired Jim Kim. Buddy will tell you straight up that if that no man's land of athletic directors hadn't occurred, he would have been out of a job. But didn't, and finally, when Jim Kim arrived and put a real emphasis on athletics, Dartmouth football started to get, they already had the floor in Varsity House, a nice new construction that has a weight room and locker room and all that stuff, coaches' offices. That was already in the pipeline before Kim arrived. But he green-lighted all sorts of initiatives that led to improvements for Dartmouth sports across the board and for football. A video scoreboard, new turf for the field, a ramped-up friends group, they call it. It's a booster club that was allowed to raise enough money that they could hire Don Dobes as the defensive coordinator, and at that time Keith Clark as the offensive coordinator. And Buddy was asked to step back a little bit and be the CEO. If you've ever met him, he will micromanage a cup of coffee if you let him, and he knows that, and he has, to his credit, pulled back, allowed his coordinators to do their jobs, and he is a very good overseer and a master recruiter. He's helped bring the pipeline or establish the pipeline that's gotten the good recruits. And this season is somewhat the culmination of that process. So I think what it says about Buddy is that you've got to be able to adapt and change. He does not have a very good record as a head coach when he was the guy calling the plays and had a hand in everything on game day. During practices, he doesn't coach a whole lot. He walks around and he watches. And that's not easy for him. It's been a huge adjustment, but it's paid off, and it's allowed good people to do a good job on levels from the defensive and offensive coordinators all the way down to the assistant equipment manager. And so I think Buddy deserves enormous credit in being able to take a slightly different role than he did for the first 20 or 30 years of his career. It's not an easy thing to do, and those of us who have watched it happen, I think, are pretty impressed with how he's pulled it off.
Sure. And he's actually, I believe, isn't he now the winningest coach for Dartmouth? What would this game against Brown did it, right?
It was his 105th victory at his alma mater, and while he will tell you that it took much longer to get that 105th victory than he would have liked, it puts him one past Bob Blackman, who is the legendary coach from the 60s and 70s at Dartmouth, who showed up and, I wouldn't say made Dartmouth football relevant again, because it was always relevant, but he really made it a powerhouse and a brand. And at that time, Dartmouth football was a big name, certainly in New England and even up and down the East Coast and to some extent nationally. So to pass somebody like that, Dartmouth's version of, Bear Bryant, I guess if you wanted to make that reach, Yeah, that's an impressive feat for Buddy, and I think Blackman achieved it in a shorter period of time with winning, and then he moved on to the Big Ten in Illinois. Buddy's version of it has been twice. He has come in and rebuilt Dartmouth football from laughingstock to the leader of the pack, and that's pretty impressive.
Sure. Now, you were talking about Jim Kim, just because Jim Kim was the president for a couple of years at Dartmouth, and did he bring in Harry Sheehy, the athletic director?
He hired Harry Sheehy, the athletic director, and he just, he infused the college with, it's okay, because at Dartmouth, there's portions of the faculty and the student body that, have flipped on the old Dartmouth and say, sports isn't cool. Well, Kim came in and he said, we have lots of things that are cool, and one of them is athletics, and I'm going to get right behind it. And that was, did a great thing for the Big Green.
True. Are there any players from that Dartmouth team that might wind up in the NFL?
The NFL is such a crapshoot. You have to have, of course, the physical base attributes: speed, height, weight, power, strength. You have to have intelligence, which Dartmouth obviously comes up high on. Dartmouth hasn't had an NFL player since the early 2000s, mid-2000s, when Casey Kramer, a tight end, played for Tennessee and Phoenix, I believe. Now, you look at a couple of guys. I think the most obvious one is Swan, the career interceptions leader that we just talked about. He's not particularly fast, and the NFL is obsessed with speed. But I think if he can get into an NFL training camp, he is so intelligent that he puts himself in the right place at the right time the first time. You don't have to tell him things more than once. And that can be an issue with the NFL. I mean, they get very big, strong, powerful guys who maybe not as mentally able to adapt to all the myriad formations and plays. Isaiah Swan's going to go in there and he's going to have handled Dartmouth academics very well, and he'll say, yeah, I understand. I will be standing over here at this point. And that's how you get interceptions. That's how you get noticed. So I would say he is probably the top candidate, and couldn't happen to a nicer young man. He's an environmental studies major. Will go on at length if you want him to about awareness and how it's changing our lives. And that's one of the neat things about Dartmouth is that you can have conversations with these kids about all sorts of things. And so I hope Isaiah gets his shot at the NFL, because just as a person, he deserves it.
Yeah, great. Well, congratulations on a lot of great coverage. The day on that Harvard game, I was amazed, not only just the photographs that you took, but also the game story was pretty good stuff. So it was fun to see in the paper. And thanks, Tris, for joining us. And viewers, thanks for watching. And we'll see you again in a month with another Valley News Digest.